I often tell people that I learned more in 4 years of federal prison than I learned more in 4 years of college. And in fact, it wasn't even close. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the people I learned the most from. One was my dear friend, who I met in prison, John Turgeon, who had spent more than 20 years in prison for the crime of shooting a police officer. And this was a guy who faced what he had done straight up. He knew it was wrong, and he took whatever it took. He'd served in maximum security prisons, and he'd taken full responsibility for what he'd done. He had apologized to the officer and to the officer's family, and he took nothing for granted. And he spent, I think it was 26, 28, something like that, years in prison before finally being released. And this was a guy who learned his lessons deeply. He had a code. He ran so many people run hustles in prison, and he would have no part of it. He took nothing out of the dining hall. He worked hard at his prison job, and he learned his lessons. God bless him, and now he's free. Good for you, John. Best to you. My dear, dear friend Bird, Andre Coleman, um, who was serving a long time sentence on the 3 strikes and you're out thing, had been most recently convicted in a bank robbery that he got involved in for lots of complicated reasons through his son. And he faced this so deeply. And he was so, I remember walking the track with him, and he told me just how ashamed he was that not only had he lost his way, but he had participated and agreed to his son losing his way as well. Bird took responsibility for himself and for his crime. And he was the kindest person I knew in prison. He would, every birthday for his homies or his friends, he'd bake a bowl of stuff, homemade stuff, and he'd deliver it to them. He always was helping people in every possible way that he could. Bird was just a dear, dear guy. And was looking at probably not getting out of prison before he died. And just recently, I learned during the pandemic, he had applied to a judge, and in a miracle I'd never heard of before, he was granted compassionate release. And so he went home. So many people have faced themselves so deeply in prison, and I learned so much from them, and I am forever grateful for this. And one of the things that I learned is, there are a lot of guys who do a few years in prison and don't learn a lesson and get out. And my lawyers were thinking I might get 1 or 2 years in prison and then be released. But I ended up getting more than 4 years. And I ended up being grateful for that because it gave me the time, and it really forced me to look deeply within myself and to realize that you don't get over things. You don't heal the deepest mistakes, the cruel things you've done, the stupid things you've done, unless you're willing to face them deeply. And the bravest and the smartest and the best professors I had in prison were the guys who had faced themselves deeply. Juan Musa, who was in prison for a ridiculously long sentence for a relatively small drug crime, and helped people in every way he could, and stayed in touch with his family. And I learned so much from him. So many people like this. And I learned the value of facing things deeply, facing our inexcusable mistakes and behavior deeply, and still in there finding compassion for ourselves. My dear friend Kyle, uh, who spent time in solitary confinement, in meditation, finding himself deeply, and is among the wisest people I know, about to be released sometime next year. My dear friend Francisco Crespo, who called himself a thug when he went into prison and was, when I knew him, just a radiant, a kind of spiritual aspirant, just one of the most vibrant and alive people I know. So many good people. So if there's a lesson, if there's something I've learned, it's go deep, be willing to face it all, and be willing to bring compassion and love to yourself and others in the hardest places. And yes, it can even be done in prison. Thanks so much for listening. More soon. Thank you all.